When human rights are imperiled in one country, they very often require an international response if they're to be effectively protected. I'm very conscious of how many people in this room are deeply associated with the civil rights movement in the United States, and how some of the older members of the audience have been involved for some decades. George Barrett, in whose memory this award is conferred, was a pioneering civil rights lawyer in Tennessee in the 1950s and the 1960s and thereafter. I had the honor and privilege of knowing George for 20 years. I'd spent a brief time working with David Prouty in the legal department of what was then the Amalgamated Textile and Clothing Workers Union here in New York when Bruce Rayner was president. That led to me spending a number of months working with George in Nashville, and it allowed me to bring that inspirational experience back to Ireland, where for 2 decades afterwards I enjoyed his friendship and counsel. That connection gave me the privilege of sitting on the award committee, and that's my excuse for being here. I do so with a distinguished panel that includes Darren Robbins and George Barrett's daughter, Mary, who followed in her father's legal footsteps and is also here this evening. The American civil rights movement inspired a civil rights movement in Ireland that began in the 1960s, and that movement sought basic equality in matters such as housing and jobs for a Catholic nationalist population in the north of the country, which had been subjected to decades of discrimination. That civil rights movement in Ireland became so tumultuous that it was followed by 30 years of armed conflict, known with uncharacteristic Irish understatement as the Troubles. That meant that my generation grew up with a nightly news of bombings and shootings on the streets of our island, to the point where we believed after 30 years it might just never be any other way. The killings might just simply continue. But we in Ireland were extremely fortunate to become the subject of international political attention when President Bill Clinton appointed Senator George Mitchell to chair peace talks, which ultimately culminated in the Good Friday Belfast Agreement of 1998. Bill Clinton and Tony Blair, the then UK Prime Minister, reached the peak of their political powers and deployed them in what has proven to be the foundation of a lasting peace on the island on which we live. George Barrett was a regular traveller to Ireland throughout that period and was a close observer of that peace process. And that process teaches us that what appear to be intractable conflicts of our time can and must be resolved with political and legal solutions. International law now provides an essential baseline for any such processes and is key to any realistic prospect of ending conflict. I'm also delighted that the inspiration that I have got from the work of journalists here that has been celebrated over the years that I have been fortunate and honoured to sit in the audience at these awards has led to an internationalizing of the awards this year, even further afield than the United States and Canada. And I appreciate there has been an international element, but we've gone a little further afield now, and I'm thrilled to be a part of that, and I thank Bruce and Alex Lescaz for all of the incredible support that they gave to that process. Lawyers who practice in the human rights and civil rights arenas operate on the legal front lines of these conflicts, and they do essential work in forging solutions to age-old problems. Tonight's recipient of the George Barrett Award, Philippe Sands, has devoted his entire career to practicing, teaching, and writing about international human rights, and he exemplifies the vision and the commitment and achievement that this award celebrates. The relevance of that work does not need to be emphasized at this precise point in our history. The war in Ukraine, the attacks of the 7th of October, and the war in Gaza throw up enormous challenges, which, if they are to be resolved in a just and fair manner, must incorporate international standards of human rights which are respected and ultimately enforced through international courts and tribunals. More than ever, we need the international legal community to focus upon a means of imposing agreed basic standards. Philippe Sands has practiced on the legal front lines of each of those conflicts. He appears as a barrister and as counsel before the International Court of Justice, the European Court of Human Rights, and the International Criminal Court, amongst others. He's Professor of Law at University College London and is currently also a visiting professor at Harvard University. He's the author of 17 books on international law, and I'll just go through each of them. No, perhaps I won't, and Philippe will understand if I spare you that. I'll briefly mention three. Philippe is probably best known for his worldwide bestseller, East-West Street, published in 2016, which is a compelling account of the Ukrainian city of Lviv's contribution to modern international criminal law, based, as the account is, on the lives of his grandfather, Leon, who fled the Russian invasion, and two lawyers who conceived the legal concepts of crimes against humanity and genocide, which were then prosecuted for the first time at the Nuremberg trials. Philippe traces the connections of these central characters through his book, and thus gives us a riveting insight into his own inspiring career in international law. He followed up the East-West Street with the Rat Line, published in 2020, which gives an account of the life of a senior Nazi SS officer, Otto von Wachter, and traces his life as a fugitive on the run in the aftermath of the Second World War. In 2022, Philippe published The Last Colony, which is a book that describes how in the 1960s a secret decision was made by Britain to offer the US space in the Chagos archipelago in the Indian Ocean to create a military base, which led to the forcible deportation of the entire local population. Philippe secured a landmark ruling from the International Court of Justice in 2019, which ruled that Britain had illegally detached Chagos from Mauritius, and in that case, he exposed the stark and enduring consequences of colonial power in the late 20th century and the devastating consequences for communities and peoples. Philippe has spent his entire professional life committed to the role of international human rights law and exposing its breaches at the highest level. Subsequent to the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Philippe commenced and has since led the campaign for the establishment of an ad hoc, as it will have to be, international tribunal for the prosecution of Vladimir Putin for the crime of aggression. That campaign has garnered worldwide support from tens of countries and from political leaders across the world, and it continues to this day. He has most recently appeared, only a number of months ago, before the International Court of Justice as counsel for the State of Palestine, seeking an advisory opinion from the International Criminal Court at the request of the General Assembly of the United Nations, and has made those submissions to the International Court in February of this year on the right of self-determination of the Palestinian people. He has placed his faith in international law as providing the basis of the resolution of those conflicts which require immediate legal and political resolution. I am absolutely delighted that the Sidney Hillman Foundation is tonight honouring Philippe Sands, whose professional career exemplifies the public spirit and activism of George Barrett, and who has distinguished himself in the best tradition of public interest law by working on behalf of those without money or power to secure their basic civil and human rights, and to address the legacies of colonialism, and to protect also the global environment. It's my honour to present this award now to Philippe Sands.
There's something especially lovely about receiving an award for your work on colonialism from an Irishman. touches me hugely. I'm really, really honored to be here. I mean, I've been sitting here in awe of this extraordinary community, starting with the fabulous folks from Starbucks and all the journalists and the writers who have contributed, because as Peter said, without your work in journalism and writing and books and articles and television, and I have a daughter who lives in Oakland, and I watch that film with particular anxiety as a parent. Thank you for that fantastic piece of reporting. It's really humbling to be here and to be with you this evening. As Peter has said, my work is, of course, different from George Barrett's. I work in the international domain. I didn't have the privilege of knowing George. I have had the privilege, and I do have now the privilege of knowing George's wonderful daughter Mary, and I'm incredibly grateful to her and Peter and all the judges for bestowing this honor on me. I did a bit of checking up on George Barrett just to see to what extent our lives overlapped, and I did find points of connection. One of the points of connection, curiously, was that George Barrett and I both attended universities or institutes of higher education in which we were the last year in an all-male environment. It just seems incredible. I just went to my 40th university reunion, and we were all men. Actually, we were all white men. That was the world that I grew up in. And as you've seen from the photographs, thankfully, I've moved into a different world. George, I think, had, in a sense, a similar background in that way. He also has a love for Edmund Burke, and often cited a quotation of Edmund Burke's that I often rely on and which inspires me. "All that is necessary for the triumph of evil," wrote Edmund Burke, "is for good men and women and others to do nothing." And that, I think, is what today is very largely about. Just listening to all of your speeches who've received awards today, you didn't do nothing. You stood up and you responded to things that outraged you. And that is, I think, the spirit of Hillman and the spirit of George Barrett. I've had my life in international law. I blend teaching. I still love being with my students. I do cases, and increasingly I write books because I've come to understand that that is the way, writing and words and podcasts and film and related things, that you reach even bigger audiences. It's one thing in academic communities, it's one thing being in the courtroom, but if you really want to reach a bigger audience, you've got to do so through the power of the word, spoken or written. And I think Hillman is doing a fantastic thing in supporting this incredible journalism. I could spend a long 3 hours giving you a basic lesson on international law, but I'm going to keep it really simple. What many of you won't know is that 1945 was an absolutely remarkable year. A revolution happened in 1945, and the revolution was that for the first time in human history, the leaders of states, communities, countries, kings and presidents and prime ministers became subject to limitations on their powers. Unbelievably, until 1945, if a state wanted to kill half of its own population, there was no rule of international law that stopped that. The change came because of the horrors of that period in the 1930s, right up until 1945, and the run-up to Nuremberg and the creation of the United Nations, in which the United States played an absolutely central role, FDR in particular, creating those conditions. And the basic premise was that individuals have rights and group have rights. And essentially, and putting it at its simplest, what I work on is to maintain that extraordinary moment in which each of us, as individuals, as members of groups, were entitled to rights not only under our national legal system, but under our international legal system. Now, there are many examples of the cases that I've been involved in, many of which involve terrible acts of mass murder on an industrial scale or desecration of the environment on a terrible scale. I could talk about Palestine and Israel, I could talk about Ukraine and Russia, but I want to focus, you will have seen the pictures here from a case that I have a particular affection for, because it's a case about decolonization. And in an earlier picture, you'll have seen me sitting next to a remarkable lady. And I just want to, in a sense, dedicate this to Lisby Elysée. Lisby Elysée was born in 1953. You can see her up there right now. When she was 20 years old, as she told me, she was born on a small island called Peros Banhos. You can look it up in the Chagos archipelago, population 400. The total population of the Chagos archipelago was about 2,000. All of the inhabitants were black, and they were all descended from enslaved people who had come largely from Mozambique. And she lived very happily on her island. She got married in 1973, and then, as she described to me, she saw something on her island that she had never seen before. She saw a white man. And the white man came to her and said, "You will leave this island tomorrow with one suitcase." And when Lisby told me that story, it touched me very deeply, because that's the story of what happened to my grandfather's mother, my great-grandmother, in Vienna in July 1942. She was told she would leave her home within one day, and she could take one suitcase. And from the moment Lisby told me that story, we have been incredibly bonded. And the reference that Peter made was to a case that I've been involved in for 15 years, in which she has spent 50 years of her life with her remarkable nephew, who's the guy on the right, Olivier Bancu, who has litigated for 20 years in the English courts. And finally, what they have achieved, because it really is their work, with an incredible team of lawyers that I've been privileged to work with, is a ruling from the World Court in The Hague that they were subjected to a wrong. That wrong must be made right by the United Kingdom and the United States, and she is entitled to go back to the islands from which she was removed. And last year, we went back together, a little group of us, and final negotiations hopefully are now underway. It's a way of signaling that in these terrible times in which we live, you are all aware of the events of the 7th of October in Israel, of the terrible events that have followed and are continuing today in Gaza, of the attacks on civilians in Sudan, in Ukraine, and so many other places. The one thing that we have, as Aung San Suu Kyi put it to the International Court of Justice in a case in which I opposed her, she was the Nobel laureate acting for Myanmar to justify the mistreatment of the Muslim community of the Rohingya in Myanmar. The one thing she said that we have in common is the language of international law. And with that, I agreed with her. And it is to that, and all of the many, many people I've been privileged to work with, that I dedicate this award and express my deepest thanks to the judges of the George Barrett Prize and to the Hillman Foundation for honoring me. Thank you so much.